want to thank the school business officials for their support. I also want to thank our out-of-town panelists for their travels. And I also want to thank our wonderful Institute staff, Bob Bullock, Patty Coudrette, Michelle Charbonneau, Mike Cooper, Joe Chamberlain, for their hard work in making this event work. And now I'd like to introduce our Executive Director of the New York State Association of School Business Officials, Mike Borges. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute, especially Tom and Bob, for once again hosting our second annual School Finance Symposium. And I want to thank Casey Seiler from the Times Union, he's the state editor, for moderating today's panel discussion. And our esteemed panelists who have traveled rather long distances to share their experience and expertise with us today. Today's event and the other research and policy initiatives that we have undertaken over the past 2 years are part of a comprehensive effort by the New York State Association of School Business Officials to be both a research resource to state policymakers and the media on school finance issues, and to help shape the discussion on these vital matters to our public schools and their students. School business officials are vital to the success of our public education system and must be part of the discussion at both the state and school district level on how resources can be more efficiently allocated to improve student academic achievement. The association late last week released our 5th school finance report of the year entitled "Where Does the Education Dollar Go?" And I believe the report is out there in the lobby. I also want to mention that ASBO's president, Herb Chesler, is here. Herb, you want to just, okay. He's from Long Island. He came up here for this event. And thanks to leaders like him, our association has been able to accomplish so much in such short time period. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Casey. Thank you very much for coming.
Good morning. I'm Casey Seiler. I am the state editor from the Albany Times Union, the co-host of New York Now on WMHT. I will keep my remarks short because I realize that every minute that I talk is a minute that you are not hearing from our esteemed panel. I would, however, just like to note that this symposium is especially well-timed because we are talking just a couple of weeks before homeowners in New York will receive a tax-freeze check from the government, which is coming, believe it or not, just a couple of weeks before voters head to the polls to re-elect many of the people who negotiated that tax relief check. As my esteemed colleague Rick Carlin noted last week in the paper, the message on the check reads, "Dear taxpayer, last year's state budget included this family this is for the $350 check that will go out, that has gone out and is being received right now by about 4 million New Yorkers, included this family tax relief credit. This tax relief is part of New York State's new effort to reduce taxes. I would bet my own $350 tax family credit that hopefully is in the mail when I get home today, that the tax freeze checks that go out in October will have a similar message." So I think we can all agree that our goal for today would be working out ideas that can result in future checks that go out to New Yorkers bearing the message inspired by ideas from the 2014 Balancing Educational Excellence with Tax Relief Symposium at the Rockefeller Institute. Before I introduce the panel, just a couple of ground rules. We will first hear 15-minute presentations from our panel. Bob Bullock will be warning them when they get down to their time limit. If they go over 15 minutes, Bob has a blowgun. He will be hitting them in the neck with a powerful Bolivian neurotoxin. Per Rockefeller's own interest in South America, the Institute has an amazing collection of South American neurotoxins. Don't worry, it's only 5 minutes of paralysis. You'll be wheeled away and you'll be good for the Q&A period. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce our outstanding panel in the order in which they will be speaking. First, Deborah Cunningham, Director of Education and Research for the State Association of School Business Officials. You may applaud if you wish. To her left, Andy Ryschowski, a fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, a professor emeritus of public policy and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his doctorate in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Moving down the table, Luke Schuster, the Deputy Director of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. He formerly served as 2 terms as a member of the Cambridge School Committee, their equivalent of school board in Massachusetts. They have interesting names for everything. He received his master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And at the end of the table, Gordon McGinnis, the president of the New Jersey Policy Perspective, a former New Jersey legislator who served in both the Assembly and the Senate. He was also an assistant commissioner of education in that state from 2002 to 2007. He is currently a member of the Board of Governors at Rutgers. You all have cards for questions. I would encourage you to fill those out as you see fit. I believe that someone will be coming along and collecting them so that when we do get to the second hour for questions, we'll be all ready to go. And with no further ado, I will hand things over to Deborah Cunningham.
Good morning, and thank you. So it is really a pleasure for me to start out our panel remarks today. School business officials have a big stake in the question we are debating today. How can we balance the large demand, thank you, for sustaining and improving education with taxpayers' desires for relief? Although some might argue that these 2 policy directions are incompatible, we are not pursuing that matter. Rather, we are accepting the fact that the state can choose to pursue both policy goals, and we're considering the question of how best to do so. So as you listen to the panel today, please write down your questions on the cards provided and provide them and send them to the aisle for the staff that will be going around to pick them up. We have Jacqueline in the back with the camera, and Amanda is also here to pick those up and take those for you, and we'll get them to us. And then the other thing we're going to do in the second hour of the symposium, in addition to your questions, is to consider directions for change. What you think, what you, New York's educational community, think are the most useful directions for change. So we have provided a survey. You have this packet that you should have gotten, which has a paper survey on it. You also can get it online. The URL is on the slide, www.surveymonkey.com/s/finance symposium. So you can go there with your mobile phone or other electronic device and just complete. It's a very brief survey with about 7 things to rate for their usefulness, and then ideas for additional changes that we need to consider. So throughout the presentation, you're going to hear different approaches and ideas. We have summarized relevant characteristics of the 4 states that we're going to be discussing on this chart and have provided it to each of you for reference throughout the symposium. So today I'm going to start with the task or challenge that we're taking on, and then briefly review the tax policies in New York State and conclude by examining specific effects on school districts. So today's challenge is to explore the nexus or the connection between education and tax relief, to look at pressures placed on education, and to look for those win-win opportunities from other states where tax relief and education will complement each other and not compete with each other. The tax policies that I'm going to go through today are the School Tax Relief Program, also known as STAR, the tax cap, the state aid cap, and the tax freeze. The School Tax Relief Program was enacted in 1997 and took effect the following year. It's funded at $3.3 billion currently. It is a program in which the state makes payments to school districts to compensate them for reduced property taxes. There was also a middle-class STAR program enacted in 2007, but discontinued 2 years later, that provided additional targeted tax relief to middle-income homeowners. The STAR provides 2 exemptions, one to seniors over the age of 65 with incomes less than $79,050, and that's $60,100 of property value is exempted from taxes. Secondly, it provides a basic exemption of $30,000 of property value for all primary residence homeowners with annual incomes not to exceed $500,000. Unlike school aid, school tax relief is distributed in relation to property wealth. We group school districts by pupil need and resource capacity, and we show that STAR per pupil is the lowest in the 4 high-need school district categories on the left, more for average need school districts, and most for low-need school districts, in other words, in relation to property values. A property tax cap was enacted in 2011 and first begun in 2012. A lawsuit brought on by our largest teachers association questioning the constitutionality of the tax cap has just been dismissed in trial court. The tax cap limits the tax levy increase to the lesser of 2% or inflationary growth. Some expense increases are excluded from the cap, such as some pension cost increases, certain large legal expenses that might result from, say, tort actions, and then the local share of capital expenditures. Voters can approve a higher increase with a 60% or greater voter approval. If voters disapprove the budget, the tax levy is held to the previous year's levy, 0 increase. Not all school districts are affected in the same way by the tax cap. We rank school districts in property wealth deciles. A 2% tax levy increase for the poorest 10% of school districts amounted to $52 per pupil versus $451 per pupil for the wealthiest school districts, or 9 times as much ability to tax for students in the wealthiest districts. The laws of 2011 placed a cap on state aid to school districts as well as a tax cap on local revenues. It limited the future growth in school aid to the growth in personal income and specified that formula aids were to be funded within this cap. Without legislation, many aids like foundation aid and the gap elimination adjustment, which actually took money back from school districts, would remain frozen. Fortunately for schools, the state has enacted legislation the past 2 years to exceed the state aid cap. The laws of 2014 provided a tax freeze credit for 2 years. The New York City school district is not covered by this law, and the big 4 city school districts must comply as part of their city government compliance. It applies to all other independent school districts. Homeowners that are eligible for STAR may receive a tax freeze credit for 2 years if their taxing jurisdictions, including school districts, stay within the tax cap and in the second year have a government efficiency plan approved by the budget director. So this government efficiency plan must demonstrate savings of 1% of 2014-15 levy for 3 years in a row for actions that are to be implemented in the 16-17 school year and continued for the 3-year period. The kinds of efficiencies that will be considered for approval are shared services, cooperation agreements, mergers, or other efficiencies. And the legislation specifically noted that past efficiencies will be considered, and they've set a date going back to July 1st, 2012, when the tax cap was first implemented. Okay, so summing it all up, I conclude that the effect of the tax policies is not going to be the same on all school districts when you have a state with 700 school districts. There are differences in wealth, differences in available resources, differences in the ability to obtain a supermajority approval vote, and different levels of student achievement, and thus different demands for school districts to invest funds to change that level of achievement. Okay, turning now to the effects on school districts. This slide looks at the historical growth of spending, which is the dashed line on top. It's about a 5.6% increase, which is what New York State school districts experienced for about 15 years before, in the period before this time, which begins in 2010-11. And then it projects out what spending would be under the 2% tax cap and the state aid cap. And it shows that by 2016-17, there's almost an $18 billion gap. So we're very interested in understanding, if this does happen, what the impact of this $18 billion gap is going to mean for school districts. So looking at historical spending, we see that spending on New York State public school districts has grown steadily over the years, from about $24 billion in 1993 to about $58 billion in 2012. But what is interesting in this slide is, again, this picture of the rate of growth. In those first 15 years, the rate of growth was 5.6%. In those last 4 years, it's 2.1%. So the rate of growth in public school spending has slowed dramatically, and obviously these policies are directly responsible. Okay, the New York State Comptroller released a very useful report, I thought, in January of 2014 on revenue challenges facing school districts. And my main takeaway, which I think is very important for us if we're thinking of solutions, is that the Comptroller concluded that schools are facing fiscal challenges that are not likely to dissipate in the short term. In other words, these are long-term revenue problems, and to me, the corollary to that is that any solution must also be long-term. All right, we looked at the state's own financial reports over the years, and we looked at the share that education is to total state spending. And we saw a very kind of troubling phenomenon, which was in 2004, the share that education was of the state budget was 32%, but by 2013, it's 27%, a loss of 5 percentage points over 10 years. We also examined the change in total professional staff in New York State public school districts in the period that covers the Great Recession, and we found that New York State school districts lost 10% of their workforce during that period. New York State ASBO, as we know from the last symposium, has a history of looking at the stress that are placed on school districts, and we like to look at the fiscal side and the program side, because you could actually decimate your program and have your finances nicely balanced, but that wouldn't tell the whole story. So this map shows the white are school districts that had no loss. The pink is those that lost fund balance. The red is those that lost staff. And the very dark red are 261 school districts that lost both fund balance and professional staff from 2010 to 2012. So we're going to continue to look at this whole issue of school district solvency, and we're trying to improve our measures and focus on this topic as we go along. Okay, last week, New York State ASBO released this report that we provided you today. Where does the education dollar go? And it was, I think the conclusion for me, or the big takeaway, was what I call the general education squeeze. We see increases in areas other than general education, giving school districts less money to put into the general education program. So the percent of instructional expenditures devoted to general education declined 2%, and the percent devoted to special education increased 2% over a recent 6-year period. Spending on general education and special education both grew over this 6-year period, but it grew faster for special education, 28% versus 19% for general education. And looking at spending categories over a 10-year period, we found that spending on teacher retirement increased almost 300%. And spending on debt service principal increased 134%, so like 13% a year on average. Not all school districts are the same in New York State, resulting in a very different story for different groups of school districts. Ranking school districts by pupil need and resource capacity, we see that in 2007-8, the lowest need school districts spent about $5,000 more per pupil, had taxes that were 33% lower, and had more than 7 times the local revenue to draw on. These differences have continued in 2011-12. So with all these data that we've been looking at, what are the big takeaways? I just want to sum up and then I will conclude. So I came up with 4 conclusions. First, school districts have experienced long-term revenue challenges. Any solution must also be long-term. Second, support for general education has not grown over the years, which is a challenge for providing a sound basic education and implementing internationally competitive standards. Third, the state's support for tax relief is distinct from school aid, having little bearing on equal educational opportunity or global competitiveness. And finally, high-need, low-wealth school districts continue to lack the funds to provide all students the opportunity for a sound basic education. Thank you for your attention. Keep your questions coming. We'll be looking for them. Put them in the aisle, and people will pick them up. You need that, don't
you? Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, great. I want to start today with two facts that I'm sure you're all well aware of. New York is a high property tax state, and a high spending state. And here's some numbers, a table I put together that shows both from school districts that are dependent and independent, local property taxes as a percent of total school revenue, ranked from low to high. You can see that New York is at 45.8%, is considerably higher than the national average, although lower than Massachusetts and New Jersey. And what's going on here are two things. One, that the local revenue is more important. The state share is lower than the national average, and the property tax is the main source of revenue compared with those states like Alabama, for instance, which has much less reliance on the property tax than New York State. If we turn to the property tax relative to people's income, I'm going to point out two things. These are census data and the blue lines are the U.S. and New York State is in red, and you can see about more than a fifth of property tax homeowners, this is just homeowners, in New York State pay above 10% of their income in property taxes. But it's also useful to point out that over half of homeowners in New York State pay under 5%. I'm going to come back to this issue later on. New York is a high spending state, highest, these are not cost adjusted, higher relative to the other three states. But achievement, student academic performance in New York isn't commensurate with the high levels of spending. Here, data from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress, just point out that New York is statistically, there's a statistically insignificant difference between NAEP scores in New York and the national average, and Massachusetts and New Jersey rank 1 and 2, so high performance. These are some data from my colleague at Syracuse University, John Yinger, who compares the percent of students in a school district eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And these are New York's test scores in English and math. And you can see that in school districts with very few poor children, academic performance is higher relative to performance in in high poverty districts. What to do about that? There are reforms to the school funding system. There's more state aid, and these are issues that we'll come back to, I'm sure, in the Q&A. My job this morning, I think, is to really focus on the property tax. So let's turn to the property tax and school property tax relief. As Deborah has pointed out, New York spends a lot of money on property tax relief. The checks that we heard about this morning that everyone's getting, and the STAR program, almost $3.5 billion. And also restrictions imposed by the state governments on local school districts on the ability of local school districts to raise property taxes. I'm going to focus on a STAR and the tax caps. I'll start with the following, my assertion, and that is that despite these programs, New York's efforts to provide property tax relief are ineffective, or largely ineffective, inefficient, and inequitable. And let me try to make that case with the next few slides. STAR is inefficient in part because the amount of STAR tax relief you get is a function of the local tax rate. And what that means is that a school district that wants to spend more, it lowers the price to citizens. And the net result is that school districts or residents facing lower prices choose to provide higher levels of spending and higher levels of property tax than they would if they didn't have STAR. So STAR induces, in effect, more spending and more property tax. And that undercuts, in part, the property tax relief given by STAR. And the work by Yinger and colleagues has suggested that in some school districts, half the property tax relief is undone by higher property tax and higher spending than otherwise would exist. As Deborah pointed out, STAR is very inequitable. STAR just benefits homeowners. Remember, renters pay property tax through higher rents. They don't get benefit. They tend to be lower income. The sales price differential factor giving higher benefits, and STAR benefits to high price counties. And that explains the results, Deborah's results in part, that some of the low-need school districts and high-wealth school districts get the biggest property tax relief. And some recent work by Rajesh Chakrabarty and colleagues at the New York Federal Reserve Bank showed that as a result of the state aid cuts that happened after the Great Recession, a number of school districts made up for some of that cuts in state aid by raising property taxes. But they turned out to be just the high-wealth districts, so undoing some of the equalization that came out of the state aid formulas. The tax cap is a levy limit. If it's binding, what it means is that school districts are not taxing as much as they would otherwise, and that means that the levy rate, the tax rate, is lower than it would have otherwise been. And if you give tax relief through just lowering the rate, the amount of tax relief you get is proportional to the value of your property, and tax relief doesn't go to poor homeowners, or I shouldn't say poor homeowners, homeowners facing high property tax bills. It goes to them a little bit, but it also goes to every owner of property, including residents of other states like Florida who own property in New York. It goes to the owners of manufacturing and commerce and retail. They can live in the United States, they can live in New York, they could live in Saudi Arabia, anywhere in the world, and they get tax relief. And the consequence is that if you say people who face high burdens, there's a lot less money in terms of tax relief available to help those people who are really suffering the most from high property taxes, because it gets spread among all property owners. The overrides are a way of holding referenda, and it turns out that we have from Massachusetts and from Wisconsin, two states that have had overrides, that have tax caps that have been in place for a number of years. And so we can look at the actual votes and say, well, what if those states, and both of those states just have an override with a majority, 50% or more votes. But what if they had a 60% like New York does? And here are the results quickly for Massachusetts. The actual results, 46% passed. If they had a 60% supermajority requirement, it was down to 16%. In Wisconsin, the pass rate, which was actually about half, 50%, goes down to under 20%. So supermajorities really make a big difference and make it harder for school districts in New York State to exceed the caps. some work done by colleagues at the Boston Federal Reserve Bank suggests that it's not a random sample of school districts that chooses to override the cap. School districts in the strongest fiscal condition, and what that means is those are low-need, high-wealth school districts are much more likely to hold referenda, and if they hold a referenda, the probability of success is much greater. So over time, the equalization through the state aid formula gets undone through the override process. Okay, what should we do? How can we have property tax relief that's more effective and equitable? And I want to focus on circuit breakers. And circuit breakers, and I'll give you some examples from other states, are basically a tax relief plan that provides tax relief to those taxpayers who face high property tax relative to their incomes. And basically the state establishes a threshold, whether it's 5% or 8% of your income going to property tax. And anything above that gets, at least in part, subsidized by the state. And New York has a circuit breaker program, but it is so miserly and small that it's, I called it in name only circuit breaker program. Here's a map. Circuit breakers are most frequently, in most states, just for the elderly, and those are this color, and the yellowish color are for all ages, and that tends to be most of the northeast part of the United States. And here's a table of a few states, and look at New York. You don't qualify for the circuit breaker unless your income is below $18,000. That's a very low income, especially in New York. And if you qualify, great, you qualify, but what's the maximum credit? If you're under 65, $41. And you know your property tax bill, that you'd hardly notice that. But the story is different in some other states. Look at Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts is just for elderly, but the income ceiling is $80,000. New Jersey, which has elderly and non-elderly, an income ceiling of under 65, $75,000. Those numbers are indexed for inflation. Wisconsin is a relatively low state. Minnesota and Maryland are also states with income limits and maximum relief that's substantially higher than we find in New York. What else? What other lessons are there from other states? One, if you're going to have targeted tax relief like a circuit breaker, index it for inflation over time, or you end up with a situation like you have in New York. If we eliminated the sales price differential factor from STAR, that would make STAR tax relief more equitable, and it would also free up a substantial amount of money that could be used to fund something like a circuit breaker. The big impact of having a supermajority, so moving just to a straight majority with the tax cap, would certainly enable more school districts to increase spending if the local voters thought they wanted to spend more on education. And a property tax deferral program, I can come back to that if they're in the Q&A. Just let me conclude with some general statements about the property tax. And people dislike the property tax a lot, and but you have to ask the question, well, what's the alternative? Now, we could go to a system of all state aid, but California is a good example of what happens if you do that. People are willing to support the property taxes if they know, hey, my kids are going to get a better education. But are you willing to pay more state taxes? Because they'll go to lots of things. Are they going to come back to my community? In California, which was a high spending state, went to be one of the lowest spending states in the country. And it turns out that property tax revenue is a very stable source of revenue. Over the recession and the financial crisis, school property tax revenue in New York continued to grow. We know what happened to state aid. State aid, funded by very cyclical revenue sources, state income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax, declined substantially. The numbers are there. if we think, okay, we'll get rid of the school property tax, but we'll still have a local tax, move to a local sales tax, for instance, the inequities would be even greater. And one of the virtues, one of the reasons people hate the property tax is that it's very visible. You get a bill, you see it, it's in your face, and that's a bad thing politically, but it's also a virtue in the sense that it leaves taxpayers to be much more diligent about what school boards are wanting. They see a connection between the taxes they pay and what they get. That's not necessarily true for the sales tax with dribs or drabs or other local taxes. And don't have time to talk about the administration of the property tax. There are big problems in New York State, but they could be improved. And in principle, I think we could have a well-administered property tax system and a well-designed state aid system that would allow us to have both property tax relief and high-quality education. Thank you.
I'll just start while the PowerPoint's coming up. Thanks a lot, Deborah, for inviting me. My name's Luke Schuster. I'm Deputy Director at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization in Massachusetts. A long history of looking both at state and local tax policy in Massachusetts and school funding over the years. My presentation is going to do a couple things really quickly. First is just set the broad context. Second is give a really quick 101 on how our property tax cap in Massachusetts works. We call it Proposition 2.5. And then look at the effect of that property tax cap and actually at the effect of a series of state level income tax cuts in the late 90s on school funding over the past 2 decades, roughly. So first, it's just really important when we're having school funding discussions to put it in the context of all the other important things we do together through our state and local governments. Schools, obviously, early childhood support through subsidies to provide slots in private daycare centers for low-income families, investments in our roads, public transportation, parks, libraries, ensuring safe drinking water, public safety, prisons and the courts, healthcare, other types of human service programs. We sort of, in all of the states, have a partnership between state and local governments to provide all of these important services. The next slide I'm going to show you is going to look at the sort of broadest possible measure of how states are doing in supporting those programs. It's going to look at a 50-state comparison of state and local tax collections as a percent of individual state economies and how that's changed over the last 30 some odd years. What do we see? Massachusetts actually cut taxes more than every other state in the country except for South Dakota since the late 1970s. We have a reputation of being a high tax state. Some of you probably have heard the label Taxachusetts. That moniker has really stuck, but the reality has changed dramatically over this time frame. There's a lot that's happened in here. Some is just broad economic changes that have affected all states. The eroding sales tax base leading to lower sales tax collections is a good example. A couple big changes in Massachusetts were passage in 1980 of Proposition 2.5, which is our property tax cap, and I'll explain that, the mechanics of it on the next slide. And then again, a series of state-level cuts to the state income tax that was phased in from the late 90s to early 2000s. And those sort of the state and local cuts combined lead to this picture. Proposition 2.5 passed in 1980. Caps the ability of cities and towns to raise revenue 2 main ways. The 2.5 locally is kind of confusing because 2.5% functions as a cap in 2 very different ways. And I'll just describe it by walking us through how this functions for a made-up community that has a total property wealth of $100 million. So the first way the 2.5% caps is we have a levy ceiling, which just says you can't raise more than 2.5% of the total property wealth in that city. So in this case, you could never raise more than that $2.5 million a year. The other way that 2.5% applies has to do with growth from one year to the next. You have last year's levy, and I've just made this up as at 1.5 million. The subsequent year, that community can only raise 1.5 plus 2.5%. So there's a little bit of growth allowed there for that levy limit. So for this community, if their prior year, there we go, if their prior year was at 1.5 million, they couldn't raise anything in this green section, even though their levy ceiling was at $2.5 million. There's a couple ways that communities can raise above those basic limits. So again, we have last year's levy. Again, you're allowed 2.5% growth into the next year. There's an accommodation for new growth, reflecting the idea that if new properties come online, there are greater costs to service them in a sense. You can pass a general override, which permanently raises the levy limit. And like Andy said, in Massachusetts, we need just a simple majority to pass a general override. And then you can separately pass a debt or capital exclusion to fund a particular capital project, and that's just a temporary raising just to fund that specific project. So what's the effect of this been on education funding in Massachusetts? Again, Proposition 2.5 was passed in 1980. Sort of over the decade of the 80s, there was an increasing sense that both sort of on the sort of adequacy test, all districts were spending less on their schools than we'd like, and there was an increasing concern about equity across districts. And so in the early 1990s, the legislature passed a landmark education reform law in 1993, which did two important things on the school finance front. One was dramatically increased state aid across the state to local school districts, and it committed to do that in a much more uniform, equitable way based on actual need. So the next two slides are going to show you how that's worked. Chapter 78 is what we call our state aid to local school districts, and the ed reform law was passed in 93, and there was a commitment when that law was passed to dramatically increase aid over 7 years. And there are a lot of people who are frankly very skeptical that the state would follow through on this commitment. Fortunately, the timing coincided very nicely with the national economic boom of the 1990s, and the state was able to follow through on this, more than doubling Chapter 70 over the first decade of what we call ed reform in Massachusetts. Then in the late 90s, early 2000s, though, we started phasing in dramatic state-level income tax cuts, and you see a very different picture in the second decade of ed reform with an erosion of some of those increases over time. The other piece of ed reform, like I said earlier, was a commitment to distribute the aid in a much more uniform, equitable way based on actual need. This next slide is going to walk you through kind of a stripped-down version of how our school funding formula works. And I'm going to do it by comparing two sample communities, Worcester and Newton. And for folks who don't know, Worcester is a small-sized city, very low income, low property wealth, and Newton is a sort of a wealthy suburb of Boston. My sense is that the mechanics of this are similar to how it works in New York, but I'm sure there are important differences. So the first step in our formula every year is to calculate a foundation budget for the local school district, and that's the state's estimate of what it should cost to provide an adequate baseline education. Doing this in per pupil terms so we can make apples to apples comparisons. And we see the state sort of recognizes that Worcester has significantly greater needs in its schools. Interestingly, there's a sort of report that was released in the early 90s around the legislature's work creating this formula. And they were very explicit. They had gone around talking to local school district superintendents, saying, you know, what should we be doing in our schools? What's the right role for the state to play in sort of leveling the playing field? And the one thing they heard over and over was a concern that lower income kids weren't getting the supplemental supports in their communities outside of the school day. And if there's one thing we could do in our schools to help level the playing field, it would be to extend the school day in lower income communities or provide vacation week programming, do better academic supports in the summer. And these additional resources were targeted very directly to try and help districts do that. So then the next step is just to look at sort of uniform measure of how much local communities can reasonably contribute. And here we see a sort of opposite where Newton is expected to contribute significantly more based on their local property wealth and incomes. And then the state fills the gap in Chapter 78. And here we see the sort of progressive nature of the formula, the state contributing roughly 6 times as much per pupil in a community like Worcester than in a community like Newton. We add in a 4th step, which is really outside of the state's calculation, but is an additional local contribution that communities can choose to make on top of the floor requirement of them. Many communities in Massachusetts, like Worcester, are spending just at their required minimum. Wealthier towns, like Newton, spending $6,000 on top of their $8,000 requirement. So at the beginning of this process, the state recognizes that Worcester has greater needs, but at the end of the day, for a kid in a classroom in Newton, they're having much greater resources spent on their behalf. So why is it, if the foundation budget were accurately reflecting the true needs of our communities, why is it that taxpayers in Newton are choosing to spend that extra $6,000 per kid? We did a little bit of research looking into this recently to see if we see any interesting trends across the major education spending categories. It actually sounds very similar to some of the research that Deborah's done. So first, I'm going to compare the foundation budget assumption for employee health insurance with what districts are actually spending statewide. We see a gap of over $1 billion statewide. Very similar story for the 2 main special education cost categories. If you combine all of these together, we see that the foundation budget sort of understates what districts are actually spending on these 3 categories by over $2 billion a year. This story is probably not that surprising to folks in this room. The main kind of cause of these is on health insurance. Health insurance costs have just risen dramatically nationwide, and there's a real limit to what local school districts can do to rein in those costs, short of just changing the split that they're requiring of their teachers to contribute. And then on special education, we see a dramatically different proportion of high needs special education kids in our schools, and our funding formula has never been adjusted in the last 20 years to account for those changing demographic trends. So we see these sort of rising fixed costs in a sense. What's the effect of that on kids in our classrooms? This graph does the same comparison of the foundation budget to actual spending statewide. Here's the gaps on those health insurance and special education. This looks just at the wealthiest 20% of districts in Massachusetts. They're still spending actually a little bit above the foundation budget assumption on regular education teachers. How is that? Well, they're raising significant additional revenue to make sure that sort of their overspending here doesn't force cuts in the core education program. Let's contrast that with what's happening in the least wealthy 20% of districts in Massachusetts. Very similar story here. But we see the least wealthy 20% of communities spending almost a third below that foundation budget assumption on regular education teachers. What's that meant on the ground is fewer teachers hired, larger class sizes, fewer prep periods for teachers to prepare for their kids. I've set this up over the last 2 slides as kind of a rich versus poor. If you look at the breakdown foundation compared to actual spending across all wealth quintiles, we see that everybody's spending below that foundation budget assumption on regular education teachers, except for just the wealthiest 20% of communities. So kind of bringing this back full circle to the discussion of property tax caps, I'll just say, if you cap revenues at inflation or below sort of a consumer inflation measure, which many of our states have done, without recognizing the fact that we know there are core inputs that are rising much faster than those consumer inflation measures in our schools, there's an implicit decision that you're making to shortchange the core education program in all but the wealthiest districts in your community. So I think sort of on the face of it, it's very easy to say, you know, I'm all for property tax relief in sort of the abstract, but I think it's really important for these conversations to tie that with the important programs that those dollars ultimately support. Thanks.
before we hear from Gordon McInnes, I just want to say, no, please, Gordon, come on up. In the next 5 minutes, if you could please complete your questions, and they'll be collected. And in the next 15 minutes, if you could please complete the survey so we can offer some results before the end of the symposium. Thanks very much. And now, Gordon McInnes.
Good morning. To those of you in the left-leaning room over there, I don't have a PowerPoint. You're going to have to look this way or just go to sleep. And that's why I want to get rid of that. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank the association and the Institute for hosting this and inviting me. Actually, it's a chance for me, coming from the Garden State, to try and balance some of the derision in which our state is held by people in the Empire State. The opportunity to be in Albany, where my research discloses that the ratio of indicted legislators is higher in Albany than it is in Trenton. So it's and I have some other contrasts that I want to draw in my remarks. But let me just say that trying to achieve excellence in education in the age of property tax limits and in the age of a cap on spending just makes more complicated and difficult a problem that has already existed. So one theme that I want to leave is that the relationship between high spending and achievement is not nearly as direct as advocates for higher state aid would have you believe, nor is it as irrelevant as the reform movement would have you believe. There is a connection, but it's not a strong connection. And that's shown, by the way, even though it wasn't adjusted for cost of living, in Andrew's slides, which show New York leading the nation in spending per pupil and coming in 30th in terms of performance on the 8th grade NAEP test. And in New Jersey, where we are not quite leading the nation, I think we're 3rd or 4th in education spending per kid, only Massachusetts prevents us from winning the top prize in student performance. So the political facts are pretty clear as to the nature of the problem. In all of our states, there are a lot more homeowners than there are advocates for equity and excellence in education. And as a politician, you run into 100 people a day. You take those 30-second conversations and you begin to form an opinion about what would work and what wouldn't. You hear a lot about property taxes. You don't hear anything about the fact that in a district in Morris County, New Jersey, one of the wealthiest counties in the country, nobody's worried about the fact that kids in Newark or Camden aren't performing very well. And so the politics and the numbers are on the side of dealing first with the property tax issues, which are very big in all of the states, well, maybe the exception of Wisconsin, but very big in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. All right, now I'm going to talk briefly about some facts that are pretty obvious, well-known, highly documented. And this is what I call my OMG section. Oh my God, he's going to talk about stuff we've heard about for decades. Why is he even bothering with this? Here's what's important when setting policy for education. It is best if we base that policy on things that are actually well known. That we base that policy on the facts that are indisputable, that we base the policy on trying to correct a long-standing gap between what happens to kids who are born to poor families and what happens to kids who are born to affluent families. Now, this, as I said, is well known. Think about this. The Title I program will celebrate 50 years next year. Lyndon Johnson, Great Society. What was he doing? For the first time, he was saying, look, we have a lot of kids who aren't doing well in school, and they are in poor districts, and they're going to school with other poor kids, and the federal government needs to step in and provide operating budget support to those school districts so that the kids have a better chance. Isn't that what Title I is supposed to do? And they skew the formula a little bit, and a lot of the money doesn't go to very poor places, but that was the idea. So, buried in the usually long federal legislation was one paragraph that has not really received very much attention, but which in the end is probably more important in terms of trying to set policy. There was a paragraph that directed the Secretary of, the Director of the Office of Education, I don't think we had a department yet, to establish a commission, gave the commission a budget and a schedule for reporting. They were to report on why it is that, what explains the differences in performance among students in the United States, and what can we do about it. It was called, in the end, the Coleman Report. It was a cross-section of scholars and interests that knew about education. And Lyndon Johnson wanted to use the Coleman Report, because he was so certain this was going to be the case, to take the next step in federal assistance to school districts. The first step was operating support districts with poor kids. He wanted to use the Coleman Report to, for the first time, have the federal government get involved in supporting the modernization of facilities. And he was expecting that the report would come back that kids who are not performing well academically go to schools that don't have libraries or art rooms. They're not well maintained. They need to be modernized. They need to be replaced. That's not what the commission came back with. Instead, they came back with some facts that were not terribly surprising, but were kind of shocking. Let me put it into the context of New York State. If I stood here and said I wanted to give you dramatic new information that will really shock you, and that information is that kids in Scarsdale and Rye, New York, perform better on the New York State tests than kids in the South Bronx, and I wanted to offer that as shocking new information, you would laugh. Well, no, you probably wouldn't. It's not that funny. But nobody would be surprised by that revelation, and that's what the Coleman Commission established. The most important determination in the variation in the achievement of students is the social economic status of their family. Newton, Massachusetts, is filled with highly educated, a lot of two-parent families with very high incomes who are devoted to making certain that their kids get the best possible education. And that shows in their willingness to increase their spending, to override property tax limits, and everything else. So the second largest explanation for the variation in student performance after the social economic status of your parents is the social economic status of the kids you go to school with. Now that report was issued 47 years ago. It's been dissected and parsed, it's been examined, and the implications of it have been held up to very substantial review. And we now, in the intervening years, have millions, billions of data points that support the contention advanced by the Coleman Report that social economic status of parents and classmates are major determinants of how kids will do. There's an argument. Some say, well, actually it only explains 74% of the variation. Some say it explains 85% of the variation. But who cares? Those are the two big factors that determine outcomes. And you can look at anything. You can look at the test results by the percentage of students in free and reduced lunch in New York districts. And Luke pointed to the differences between Newton and Worcester in terms of poverty rates and that kind of thing. The higher the poverty rate, the lower the performance. You can look at the SAT scores. You can look at the national assessment. And over the years, they've calculated the gap between those students receiving free and reduced lunches and those students not receiving them. The gap is retained. It may be narrowed, and that's encouraging. But that is a fundamental fact about what school districts are dealing with. We don't want to talk about it, and that's too bad. All right, so that already took 2/3 of my time, and Bullock is up here telling me to hurry it up. The reason I think I'm here is that New Jersey has done more to try and address the gap between poor and affluent students than any state in the union. It has done so through its Supreme Court. You can remember 4 numbers: 30, 30, 30, and 32. 30 is the number of decisions that have been handed down by the New Jersey Supreme Court directing that the state greatly increase aid to poor districts. 30 is the number of districts that benefit from that, and they happen to be the poorest K-12 districts in a state that still has quite a few K-8 districts. 32 is the number of mandates prescribed by the court that were not disputable, that had to be carried out. They included such things: there has to be 1 security guard for every 250 kids. There has to be a career counselor for everybody in the 7th grade. There has to be, they added 2 years to the K-12 schedule. There has to be preschool, at least half day, for all 3- and 4-year-old kids who reside in those districts, whatever their economic status. They also said every school in the Abbott districts has to adopt a model of whole school reform. Remember when whole school reform was the topic of the day, the topic du jour? Well, they had bought the argument that these people in Washington knew what they were talking about, that there were in fact 10 or 12 approaches to dealing with the problems of poor kids that were magical and would work. They were silver bullets. Each school was ordered, not districts, every school, there are 450 of them in the Abbott districts, every school was ordered to adopt a whole school reform model, and the district wasn't supposed to intervene. There also was a mandate that the state pay 100% of modernizing all the facilities in the Abbott districts, that class size in the grades K through 3 could not be larger than 21, except in preschool where it couldn't be larger than 15. And there had to be a college-educated early childhood educator in the classroom along with a teaching assistant. So 32 different mandates, 3 of which counted. Because we all know that kids learn most when they're young, right? And there's a lot of brain research about that. And if you've ever been to a Head Start classroom, you've watched those 4-year-old kids walk out, you ask yourself, what could go wrong with these kids? Look at, they're happy, curious, they're all holding hands, they're funny, they're engaged with the teacher, and yet things happen. Early intervention counts. So the order by the court to require each district to provide high-quality preschool in a classroom not greater than 950 square feet, with a lavatory available to the kids inside the class, etc. I mean, we're talking about a high level of detail the court got into. Some districts understood that as the chance, the opportunity to do better so that kids, when they got to 3rd grade with the federally mandated tests, they would have a fighting chance to be strong readers. Guess what? If you don't read at grade level, by 3rd grade, your chances of ever reading on grade level are 1 in 7. 4th grade, 1 in 11. So getting started counts. And if you want to have a discussion about educational equity and educational excellence, you have to deal with the facts and the findings that we are certain of, not the hopes, not the hypotheses, nor the ideological inclinations of those who are seeking to change educational policy for other reasons. We need to focus on what works. In New Jersey, we have a number of districts who understood the chance, and they turned out to be the lowest spending of all the Abbott districts. They understood the chance that this represented, and they have produced dramatic improvements in how well kids read and write English in the 3rd grade. Some of them have gone on to have 8th graders who are very close to the state average in a state that is one of the top 3 performing states in the country, one of the top and the highest property tax state in the country. I'm sorry I didn't give you some numbers. I'm sorry I didn't give you the comparison between New York's efforts at limiting tax increases, but I think that the conversation needs to include what we do about this yawning gap that has existed for so long. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to all our presenters. I think, are there questions being collected that are coming around? Yes. Yes, exactly.
Hand them to the aisle.
And while I wait for those questions to be vetted, I guess I can start off with a question of my own. So we've thanks to all the panelists for the fascinating presentations. We've heard about how different states do things. How do you get there? I think we've heard about Massachusetts doing it through referenda, correct?
Just on the tax cap.
On the tax cap, right. We of course know about the court route, but in a state like New York, where so much is bound up in the year-to-year legislative process, how do you achieve the sort of fundamental change that I think we seem to agree is necessary for these changes? Go ahead, use the mic. Thank you.
So it goes back to the problem of homeowners outnumbering people who want to see education improved. It goes back to the fact that states do not raise sufficient money from other taxes like the income, sales, et cetera, to offset the amount that raised by property taxes. And property taxes pay for services that homeowners want. And they don't want to see those services diminish. They may want to make some changes on the margin, but the states do not have the wherewithal to replace dollars raised by the property tax. It overwhelms, in New York, probably, in Massachusetts, maybe, certainly in New Jersey. It overwhelms all other considerations. And we've had decades of promises. And we have, as Andrew pointed out, we have a cap on helping elderly homeowners that you can only get, if you make $149,980, you get a rebate check. Wow, that's pretty good. So I think that we're playing with a pretend agenda set by the politicians who don't want to be defeated, because they have to address those quarterly checks everybody's got to write that kill their home budgets. And they do it in the form of all of these fairly complicated property tax gizmos that, when there's a recession, fall apart.
Just let me add to that, and the politics are clearly very difficult. But one of the things that states have to learn is that they can't afford to let, and whether it's 10% or 20 or 30% of their students, mainly from poor families, not get a quality education. And the political focus in so many states now is how are we going to grow our economy? How are we going to increase income? And some way we have to figure out how to convince politicians to understand that if you don't have an educated workforce that includes all of our population, the state over the long run is going to suffer economically. And that's a hard case to make, and politicians tend to think about what's the impact next year as opposed to investments that you make now that are going to have a payoff a decade or two in the future.
Just speaking about the Massachusetts perspective a little bit, the two biggest legislative accomplishments of the past couple decades in Massachusetts were the landmark education reform law passed in the early 90s, which I was describing during the presentation, and then health reform in 2006. And the story, the kind of political organizing story behind both of those was very effective, broad-based coalitions of business leaders, labor leaders, grassroots groups organizing together to put pressure on the legislature to respond. And building on what Andy said, I think in the ed reform context, business got the economic development argument that we were going to lose ground if we didn't invest. In Massachusetts, we don't have oil wealth, natural resource wealth. What we've got is the sort of human capital of our residents, and business stepped forward to help make that case along with the teachers unions. And again, the healthcare reform story is very similar. We had a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, who helped make the case that we were sort of organizing our healthcare system in an inefficient way, and there was an economic development argument to be made for those state investments also.
Well, a question from the audience is from Barbara Greff of Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. We talk a lot about the idea, maybe even the sanctity of local control, but in 2014, what does that really mean? Haven't we really shifted away from local control to state and federal control, for better or worse? So can we define local control? What is it, and does it matter? And that's a jump ball for anybody.
I think local control does matter, and we have examples of states where the state pulls most of the fiscal levers, and citizens aren't engaged in the funding of their schools. And unfortunately, with tax caps of various kinds, that substantially reduces local control. Yes, there are overrides, but in some sense, New York has this toxic combination, and I believe it's the only state with a tax cap with a supermajority requirement. And that, given the issues that Gordon mentioned, that's a very hard sell. Agreeing to spend more for education is hard, and for elderly populations, they need to be elderly people need to be convinced that if their local schools are better, the property values are likely to rise, and they have a self-interest aside from just caring about the community in which they're living, a quite clear monetary self-interest in pushing for better schools and voting for higher property taxes if they're going to the schools. But all of those are hard political sells.
Go ahead.
New Jersey has 565 school districts that are 565 municipalities, 611 school districts. And the efforts to say, well, that's, having a superintendent for 300 kids or having 2 schools and an assistant, that's pretty expensive. Why don't we encourage some mergers, consolidation, shared services? And we've been talking about that for 30 years. And so far, it's worked. We've had 2 district consolidations in 50 years, and they took place only in towns that had the same name. The borough and township of Chatham agreed to merge their school districts, and the borough and township of Princeton agreed to merge their school districts. So it's quite a good record. We figure by the year 22-4, we'll be at a point where we have efficiently organized school districts.
That's a big one for Governor Cuomo as well, and he has had just about as much luck on it. A question for Andy. What is your evidence that STAR leads districts to increase spending that has not been the questioner's experience as a school board member?
My evidence comes from research done over the years by John Yinger and the late Bill Duncombe at Syracuse, and now some co-authors. And the arguments are, these are statistical, econometric studies, fairly high quality in my view, and have been published in academic refereed journals. And so they their results convince me. They're hard, I think, to explain in this setting, the econometrics.
Right. A question for Deborah Cunningham. I live in the Wyndham-Ashland Jewett School District, which has experienced a 10-year decline in K through 12 pupils from approximately 550 to about 450. Expenditure increases year to year have been minimal. A question: how can this size district remain viable in the future in terms of programs, teacher staffing, maintenance of facilities, etc., with so few pupils enrolled?
Well, I think that's really an excellent question, and I would note that half of our 700 school districts in New York State have student enrollments under 1,500. So this school district is certainly, I think there's only about 200 that have enrollments under 500, but that's quite a few. And so it does become a problem, and we do see an economy of scale problem in little school districts where their costs for administration and things are very, very high. What can be done? I think we have to look to a variety of options to make sure that we're providing educational opportunity to kids. And, shared services, shared functions in school districts. I know many school districts do cooperative purchasing. They contract out their payroll. There's a whole number of things. I think we also have to look at sharing on educational programs, and BOCES helps a lot. I think that our idea of regional schools, regional high schools, is something that we probably need to push, because that could be a great opportunity for small school districts or school districts that have to tuition out their high school students. It's a problem, but obviously partnering and looking at opportunities for sharing with other school districts is going to be at the heart of this.
Can I just add two quick comments? One, in some states, there's been a move towards distance education, electronic education, helping small districts. So you have a physics teacher that can broadcast to neighboring districts. And one distinction is, and I think it probably exists in New York and certainly in Wisconsin, there are some very small school districts, but they cover a very large area. And so consolidation, we're all in favor of consolidation as a way to reduce costs, but if the children then have to be an hour and a half each way on the bus, that has bad consequences for education. On the other hand, suburban districts that are very small, maybe the state has to be even more forceful and more than just a carrot, but a stick out there.
I agree. Technology is something to be looked at seriously.
A question for Gordon McGinnis. What are the other two top mandates from courts that you didn't mention that are the most important?
I'm going to speak to this room. Excuse my right shoulder, but I've been... So the important mandates from the court included class size limitations beyond third grade. It included a requirement for intensive early literacy, not in those terms, but it was clear that the court expected districts to double down on getting kids to read. And it included the, did I say 4?
I think they said 2.
And the biggest one was the requirement, of course, that there be 2 years of schooling for 3- and 4-year-olds. By the way, let me just say that this idea that judges, even justices, know enough about what works on the ground that they can prescribe all these things. All it does is lead to years of litigation and regulation writing, and it forgives school leaders who want to take comfort from the fact that they don't know what to do. And now the court has told them what to do, and that's great. And not only that, but it increases the budget and it increases the employment, which is satisfying to the mayor and to the city council, that all of a sudden this money's coming in and we can hire. I mean, there are schools in New Jersey that are serving 800 kids, and they have 16 custodians. Not quite literally, yeah, we're pretty close to it. But it is, the court set out requirements that became themselves the object of attention rather than the intent of the court's decision, which was to better serve kids who came from poor families and went to school in poor districts. And all the attention, except in a third of the districts, was focused on those things rather than on, hey, let's use this to get a lot of third graders reading.
A somewhat related question for any of you. What about the outliers, districts that are poorly funded but are achieving excellent results? What are they doing differently?
Any names given?
No.
Any names of districts that?
Well, do they exist? I mean, are they out
so
there?
I think the answer is they do exist, and the question is why, and the only way to answer that question is to look in depth. And is it a really good principal that's motivated a teacher force? Is it something else, some combinations of things? And the real question for thinking more broadly about education policy is what you find in one school district. To what extent is it replicable? And everybody tends to look for silver bullets, and there are no real silver bullets. And what works in one school doesn't necessarily work more broadly.
A question for Luke Schuster. How much of the employee healthcare costs referred to in your presentation is profit for the supplier in contrast to the not-for-profit healthcare?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Is the questioner here? I hope so. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to expand on that question just to sort of offer some context?
Yes, the not-for-profit healthcare organizations have a vastly different cost, lower than the for-profit healthcare organization. The profit goes to the stockholders, basically, of the for-profit organizations.
So I don't know. I'm not familiar with, what split district plans are across the not-for-profit or for-profit. We looked just in the most cursory way at sort of comparing healthcare cost growth in Massachusetts districts to healthcare cost growth sort of nationwide, and those mirrored each other very closely, but that's sort of the extent of what we looked at.
Another question, even accepting the idea that property taxes are a more stable funding source than state aid, do you think more equitable or at least fully funded state aid formulas would help alleviate schools' fiscal stress?
Okay, I think the answer is yes, and let me focus on the equity in funding. And the story is obviously different in every state, but as we see in New York, the amount of funding going to districts that have concentrations of poor children, where all the arguments suggest, the cost arguments that Luke made in particular, that you need more money, not less money. And so you see a state like New York where there's actually less money flowing from the state to many of the districts that have concentrations of low-income students. So New York is a state that I think is ripe for reform in the details of the distribution formula. And no reform, fiscal reform, guarantees student performance, but it's certainly a necessary, although not sufficient, condition.
I would add to that. I would say that this forum, because we were focusing on tax relief, we looked at the tax cap and some of the differences in the different states, but that's only part of the answer. And if we don't, we need to make the administration of local taxes as efficient and as effective as possible. We also need to do that with state aid. They are two parts of this same puzzle, and we need to make them both work. So, and especially, and I was talking about the long-term revenue challenges. Part of the solution will be a stable funding plan that school districts can count on that will be predictable year after year, much like the foundation formula that we tried to implement that got derailed by the Great Recession. We need to go back to that, take the important elements, and have something that school districts can truly count on.
This is my own question. Is it fair to say, as a general rule, that the best school aid funding formula is one that minimizes the annual involvement of elected officials? I'm not kidding.
Well, if you're an elected official, and we do have one here, so she could comment on this question, that's part of your job. Your job is to legislate resources to localities. So I would never want to take that away from legislators, but I think we need to respect that if we have a good basic funding formula that is providing a foundation for success for all of our kids, that we need to deliver on that. And then over and beyond that, we can do some other things that might meet some legislative. Would you add to that, Sandy?
Well, first of all, you don't want to disrespect legislators if they're physically present, for one thing.
Right. Speaking as a former legislator as well. So.
But, the legislature is charged with the governor in determining how much money is going to be raised and how it's going to be spent, and that's a pretty central obligation of the legislature. And you can have a formula, a school aid formula, and all you need is a Great Recession to knock the pins out from under that formula. The New Jersey budget, maybe the same thing happens in New York, is filled with footnotes that say, notwithstanding this statute, notwithstanding the school aid formula, for this budget year, there will be no school aid formula. And for this budget year, we've suspended the mandate that the following funds be made available to. And part of that is a consequence of economics and of declining tax revenue, tax collections versus the projections. And a part of that is the will of the legislature and the governor being exercised. But recently in New Jersey, it's been mainly the crawl out of the recession and therefore the reduced tax collections and the unwillingness to adjust revenues.
A question for Luke Schuster. In Massachusetts, what's the mechanism by which school districts spend more than the foundation and state aid as shown in your slide presentation? Is it a vote or fundraising or something else?
Good question. So just to restate again that the step 2 in my simulation is the state's required contribution of communities, and that's just a floor. So communities, have all the leeway they want to raise more local revenue and spend that. Many of the wealthier communities are well below their levy ceiling, and they have so much property wealth that just staying at their levy limit is still allowing them to contribute much more than their required minimum. So part of it is just the high spending communities. I bet Newton is not passing overrides every year. They have so much local property wealth that they're able to do that. And then it is just also the case that the communities most likely to propose overrides and succeed on those are also wealthier communities.
This question could be the subject of a whole symposium on its own, but why does New York spend more per pupil than other states? You've got 30 seconds. No, I'm kidding. That's you, Deborah. You can take slightly longer.
Does anyone want to take that? Let's see. The number of staff, the level of the salaries, and the amount of the benefits.
That only took 10 seconds. question. I agree the Coleman report is a definitive one on the negative impact of socioeconomics in academic achievement, but why is there so much denial in the New York State Education Department and others that the student's family and the peers matter?
Sorry. This becomes a tough issue to discuss. And it becomes a tough issue for a number of reasons. One is that in a lot of places, there's a strong correspondence between race and ethnicity and deep poverty. And therefore, you get into the question of whether this is not an attack on Black and Latino parents or whatever. And that leads to timidity, and it leads to avoidance of the issue. So I think that if you were able to get to the facts and the connections, that you would end up producing better policies than we're producing. And we could have a whole conference, and I'd love to be invited back if you did, on the frailties of the reform movement in addressing these issues and the irrelevance of so much of what has been proposed by governors and presidents of both parties and enforced by departments of education in governments of both parties, which have in fact compounded the problem and deflected attention from what we need to do.
Let me just add one, and it's easy to be negative and look at bad news, but let me mention just one recent study that provides, I think, a bit of hopeful news. And this looked at school reform efforts across the country, and that added money, increased spending, and targeted that spending to low-income districts, and then ask, what is the impact of this shifting of funds on students, not measuring their academic achievement, but measuring their life outcomes? Did they graduate from high school? Were their earnings higher? And the data comes from something called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. So it's a survey that's followed the same families and their children over now several decades. And the result of this very careful study is that more money, school reform had a measurable positive impact on lower dropout rate, lower crime rates, higher earnings over time. And no single study is definitive, but at least I think it ought to provide an incentive to people who are interested in school funding issues that there is a payoff, and we need to redouble our efforts in that direction.
For Luke and for Gordon, in Massachusetts and New Jersey, what isn't included in the levy cap? What else is capped, i.e. superintendent salaries, and how is that working?
There are a few things that are not included. I can't remember, actually. We included on one of the slides, but
on the chart, yes.
Yeah.
It's very similar to New York's. It's
Debt service.
let's see, we're domestic. It's capital outlay and debt, some water and sewer debt costs, some public health projects such as lead abatement, paint abatement.
yeah.
Capital was something that was across all 4 states that was excluded from the caps.
And I think that we passed ours the year of Hurricane Sandy, and I think emergency expenditures were exempted.
Two related questions. How are charter schools considered in your findings or solutions? And no one spoke about charter schools. Opinions, please. Another 2-hour symposium topic.
Well, you need another symposium,
Yeah.
and I'm only going to take 40 minutes to answer that question. So charter schools are not mentioned. First of all, they are concentrated in the same districts where we're talking about increasing financial assistance. Secondly, their record is, first of all, it's a relatively new institution. And there's great variation among charter schools in who goes to them. how they're recruited or selected, how kids get to those schools. How do they do compared to the district when you're looking at the proportion of students who are classified? Are you looking at students who are English language learners? So I've looked carefully, not recently, but I don't think the numbers have changed very much, at one of the most heavily chartered districts in New Jersey, which is Newark. And I looked, and there are some astonishing results being produced by particularly 3 charter school organizations in Newark. When you go to look at the numbers and who's going to those schools, they don't match up even remotely. No, that's too strong. They don't match up well with the numbers in the district. So, free lunch excuse my back. Free lunch in Newark for district kids is 70%. For charter schools, it's just over 50%. Reduced lunch, district school kids about 20%, charter schools about 30%. Big differences nationally in how those two groups perform. Special education, 18% for district kids, a little over 7% for charter schools. In the best performing charter schools, those numbers are, with one exception, are below 5%. English language learners. I think there were, at the last year I looked, there were 5,000 charter school students in a district where 10% of the kids were in English language learning programs. The number of those 5,000 that were in English language learning, were English language learners in the charter schools was 18. 12 of them in one school, 6 in the other. And in the meantime, there were 4,000 in the district schools. So I think that the charter schools, you have to look at it very carefully. And I don't want to sound like a charter school critic, because I'm not. I actually co-sponsored the New Jersey law that set them up. Charter schools teach us something, particularly those that are doing better. And look, if 50% of your kids are free lunch, you still have a big problem to deal with. This is not a simple problem. This is the hardest problem we ask any professional to take on. When you have concentrations of poor kids, they have shown that if you are thematic, well-organized, and focused, and increase the number of hours and days and weeks spent in instruction, particularly in the early grades, you produce better results. And so the charter schools that started in kindergarten and who run 210 or 215 days a year and end up with Saturday classes and with 4 o'clock dismissal hours, they have produced impressive results. And maybe it doesn't connect exactly with the profile of district students, but it's still a challenging group of kids they're educating, and they're doing damn well with it. So it's a mixed view. We don't know enough. I think the Credo study suggests that is the Stanford group that's looked at large samples of charter and district school kids who are alike. While it's moved up for charter schools recently, their initial study showed that 17% of charter schools kids did better than their peers in the district schools. 37% did worse, and the rest were in about the same range. So the big numbers nationally don't point to magical answers, solutions. You have to look at it carefully.
I've one thought on this that actually relates to the earlier question about the appropriate role for the legislature. I think in Massachusetts, it's been nice to have a school funding formula is seen widely as somewhat set in stone, that year to year, we look at inflation, make some adjustments, and that districts can rely on that for some stable funding over the course of the short and medium term. A really important role for the legislature, I think, over the longer term is to stimulate broad conversations around what it is we want to do in our schools in the broadest possible sense. And there was a a broad public conversation 20 years ago in Massachusetts, which led to the assumptions underlying our foundation budget. What's an appropriate class size at the high school level? What's the appropriate length of the school day? I mean, ultimately, that's more art than science. We have to make sort of small d democratic judgments about what it is we want to provide in our schools and what we're willing to pay for. And education's changed a lot over those 20 years. And I think it's really important for the legislature to be involved in those conversations. And there's a lot of things we can learn from effective charter schools, even if all charter schools aren't necessarily outperforming. I think there's a lot we can learn from good ones, and the democratically elected legislature should take a leading role in stimulating that conversation.
All right. I want to make sure it's about 10 till. Should we 5 more minutes? Okay. Well, okay. I'll ask my own question here. You mentioned the kind of Luke mentioned the job that that legislatures have in perhaps inquiring as to ways toward better outcomes. How does or does not the current debate over the Common Core standards impact this subject? Is there any kind of nexus between the two, or does it just does it in any way focus public attention on education policy in a way that perhaps 4 years ago it was not?
Well, I apologize for grabbing the microphone so quickly. With the Common Core standards, when they finally sorted out with standardized tests that are administered in a timely way rather than long before the curriculum has actually been implemented, I think what you'll do initially is to widen the achievement gap. If the standards are in fact more rigorous and intended to meet the standards of Singapore and Finland or whatever, then we're going to have a lag again and an increased achievement gap between districts with lots of poor kids and affluent districts.
Let me add to that. I think the Common Core in part came, that effort of states to come up with a common curricula, from the response to No Child Left Behind, a 2001 federal legislation, which left it to the states to set up requirements that eventually by 2014, 100% of students should be proficient, and for Black students and Hispanics and whites, and a standard that we all knew from day one couldn't be achieved. Well, one way, and the law also mandated adequate yearly progress. So a number of states chose to perform well by these federally imposed standards by either redoing their exams, making them easier, and changing the cut point, and so that the ability to, in some states, to make comparisons was greatly diminished, and the quality of education required by states for their own students were diminished. So to the extent that a Common Core says, here we're putting a base set of curriculum and then testing, has at least the potential to improve nationwide the quality of education.
All right, with that, I will turn the microphone over to Deborah Cunningham for some, I think, the summation of the survey and some final comments. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is summarize the survey results, and what we all said was the most promising directions for change. We gave you a survey that had 6 ideas on it, and people were asked to rate them. 4 was most useful, 3 was somewhat useful, 2 somewhat not useful, and 1 not useful or harmful. So interestingly, the number 1 proposal that people liked was linking the tax cap to sound basic education. If a district is underfunded, under foundation aid, allow them more flexibility to raise funds. So that's very interesting to me that came out of this conversation. And we did have, this was a very broad conversation. It wasn't narrow just on the tax cap. It really discussed education generally. So in a sense that is logical and very interesting. So an average rating of 3.4, which on a scale of 4 is quite high. Second was allowing school districts to carry over unused amounts under the maximum allowable levy limit, like New Jersey. So right now we have a law that says if you levy less than the levy limit, you get to carry that over. But the levy you're levying, if you have any capital, will include the capital, but the levy limit doesn't. So very few school districts qualify for that carryover provision. If we changed it to say if you levy less than the maximum allowable with your capital, with your permissible exclusions, then that would make it more real for more school districts and would help them to respond to this phenomenon that we see around the state where communities are sort of focused on the 2%, and even if their allowable levy limit is 5 or 6%, they don't feel they can go there. So that would give them some credit for that. So average rating of 3. The third was requiring a lower level of voter approval for overrides with an average rating of 2.9. And then fourth was getting into counting local revenues from pilots when calculating the tax base growth that is allowable. So each year, Tax and Finance increases the local levy by a tax base growth factor to represent the growth that occurred, but pilots are not included in that. Let's see. And then least popular was not requiring a public vote if budgets are within the tax cap, like New Jersey, and raising the level of tax cap to 2.5%. So let's see, do I have the thing here? So I gotta go to the next slide. Okay, there were a number of different ideas, and we kind of did this in a hurry, so if we didn't write it down exactly as you wrote it, I apologize. But we are going to prepare a report of this symposium, a brief report that includes these findings. So these are not ranked in any order. They're just all additional ideas. Pass legislation in which all public school teachers work for the state of New York, so a statewide salary schedule. Do away with school district boundaries. Allow for choice plus distance. That must be distance learning. Do away with special education and require an individual plan for all students. Change the Constitution to say New York must provide a globally competitive and equitable education instead of sound basic education, or for heaven's sake, change it somehow. Use the circuit breaker, which I assume means strengthen the circuit breaker. Increase state aid and publicize the decreases more so that when the state actually keeps taking away money, that we are more public about that. More consolidation among rural New York State school districts. I know for a fact they don't like that idea. Mandate relief, always an important thing to look at, but it's kind of a hard area. But we still, and sometimes we believe in New York State ASBO that some of the little things, the little niggly mandates, make a difference in the lives of school officials. So we will keep working on that. All right. Fund schools, I think it means, with a state income tax after a constitutional amendment, guaranteeing a specified minimum % increase per year. Would love to no longer have the tax cap and finance schools separately from property taxes. That, you know, over the years we hear this, get rid of the property tax, people don't like the property tax, but I think Andy did a nice job of pointing out that it does have many positive attributes, its stability, that kind of thing. Do away with the public vote, interesting, and elect a new governor. So those were the feedback. As I said, we will do a little report. We will have the presentations online as well as a recording of this event. I really would like to thank the Rockefeller Institute for having us and partnering with us once again. It's a really nice relationship for New York State ASBO, and we appreciate it. And to the panel, thank you so much. Very diverse and interesting panel that really, I think, made our time here spent very worthwhile. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to another symposium next year. Thank you.